Alright guys, so what we're going to do right now is take a look at Module 34, and Module 34 in the textbook talks all about the Phillips curve. Okay, friendly reminder before we get started, don't forget, please always make sure you go and check out my website, mrhess.yolasite.com. I've got copies of all the notes, helpful videos. I've got links to all the free response questions from 1999 all the way moving forward. Lots of great resources. Make sure you check it out. Okay, so I want to start this set with a brief history lesson for y'all and let you know a little bit about the Phillips curve. So this all goes back to an economist named A.W. Phillips, and in 1958, Phillips published the results of his research on the historical relationship between the unemployment rate, which we all know is U%, and the inflation rate, which is pi%. And he was looking at this in Great Britain. So he was looking at this change over time. Is there a relationship, and what kind of relationship was there? And what he found is that there was a very stable inverse relationship or negative relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. And so what that means is that anytime the unemployment rate would fall, he saw that the inflation rate would rise. And concurrently, anytime the unemployment rate would go up, the inflation rate would go down. Now, this had huge implications when it came to trade. What people were able to figure out was, okay, well, anytime the economy is not doing well and we enter into a recession, we know that prices are actually going to go down. The inflation rate will go down. However, as the economy recovers and we go into these more inflationary times, as there's more money circulating through, there tends to be lower rates of unemployment. And really, this became the working model for about 20 years, at least in the historical way that he created it. So if you look on the third slide, this is what the Phillips curve looked like in its original iteration. So we have, the inflation rate being measured up here on the y-axis, all right? The inflation rate up here. We were looking at the unemployment rate down here on the x-axis, and we had PC right here for the Phillips curve. And so on the next slide, for example, here's sort of what it would look like. So if we were to come up with, a bunch of, random hypothetical points, let's say that at, this particular marker here would be a inflation rate of 4% and unemployment would be at the natural rate at 5%. And we could say that at this point down here that, if inflation was 2%, if we have lower inflation, well, we're going to end up having a higher unemployment rate. And he saw that this was a very stable way of measuring how the economy was doing. And if it kind of looks like the line of best fit from algebra class, that's because it's essentially exactly what this is. Okay, the slope of this line, although it won't ask you to calculate that on the AP exam, the slope of the line is calculated based off of what are the trends. Okay, what are the trends between these right here? Now, this was a good model, however, it wasn't perfect. In the 1970s, we talked about inflation earlier in this course, and in the 1970s, we went through an issue called stagflation. Now, stagflation is when both the unemployment rate and the inflation rate rise simultaneously. And the American economist Milton Friedman saw this as disproof of the stable Phillips curve. He said that, look, there is not this trade-off. So he got together with a fellow recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Edmund Phelps, and he thought that the natural rate of unemployment, which we learned earlier, UN, was independent of the inflation rate. So they decided to come up with something called the long-run Phillips curve. Okay, so on slide 6, we've got all these different points, right? And what we end up seeing, the problem is, what happens when we've got these outlier points? What happens when we've got all these points outside? Either outside or inside, they don't really fit with what we were measuring. And, we're going to see these points again here in just a moment, all right? Well, he decided, let's create this natural rate of unemployment. Now, we know in the United States today that the natural rate of unemployment is usually someplace between 4 to 5%. However, those numbers may fluctuate from country to country or within the same country depending on what's going on. Remember, we said that we are at the natural rate, and you might want to write this note for yourself on slide 7 as a reminder. The natural rate exists when there is no cyclical, all right, no cyclical unemployment found. So if there's an excess amount of frictional, structural, or seasonal unemployment, and that amount's greater, then naturally the natural rate of unemployment will go up. It's all about there not being any cyclical. So in this case, we could estimate their number being someplace around 6% or so. Okay? Now, we've got this long-run Phillips curve. Now, I want to point out to y'all that the natural rate of unemployment is being held constant. And what we mean by that is that the inflation rate, okay, the inflation rate, which we're measuring over here on the y-axis, it doesn't matter. If inflation rate is up here, if we want to call that point A, or if it's down here, we could call that point B. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, gee, this kind of sounds a whole lot like when we talked about YF, right? When we talked about the long-run aggregate supply. Well, because it sort of is. And you know, we measure the price level over here. And when we're talking about the price level, we know that a change in prices, if prices increase, would be inflation. And anytime prices decrease, we would have deflation. And so I want you to see that there is a relationship there, okay, that there are some similarities. This graph does not say the exact same thing as the aggregate model, but the two graphs are very closely related, okay? And so I think that this might help y'all with better understanding the aggregate model that we looked at before. So let's move on. Now, the long-run Phillips curve comes into play here, and because the long-run Phillips curve exists at the natural rate of unemployment, any structural changes in the economy that affect the natural rate of unemployment will also cause the long-run Phillips curve to shift. So anything that increases the natural rate of unemployment would shift our long-run Phillips curve to the right. So anything making the number go from 4 to 5%, which we have here, to a larger number would make it shift to the right. So if we went from 4% up to 9%, we would go to the right. Or let's say we had changes in the economy and we went from 4% to the new natural rate of unemployment only being 3%. Well, that would shift our long-run Phillips curve inward. Okay, it would make it smaller. So today, many economists reject the idea of having a stable Phillips curve, but they accept that at least in the short run. So you might want to go through and maybe annotate this right here, okay? That there is a short run trade-off. Short run trade-off between unemployment and inflation given these stable inflationary expectations. So in other words, as long as the inflation that we're expecting is growing at a healthy normal rate, here in the U.S. we target that someplace between about 1 to 2%. As long as it's stable, we don't really worry too much about it. Now, most believe that in the long run, that the unemployment rate and the inflation rate are independent of the natural rate. In other words, that it doesn't matter, prices can be either higher or lower in the long run, but we're always going to return back to that steadfast natural rate of unemployment. Now, our analysis shows that the short run Phillips curve, which we're going to go into here in a moment, can shift either left or right. I would really make sure that you understand this bottom bullet point right here. If you can wrap your head around this concept, you are going to be golden. Okay? The key to understanding shifts in the Phillips curve is all about understanding inflationary expectations, or in other words, what we think is going to happen with prices. Okay? It's all about what we think is going to happen here. So if I pull up slide 11, now this looks very similar to what we looked at before on slide 6 and 7 with the Phillips curve, with the minor subtlety that we've changed it from just being called the Phillips curve to now we're talking about the short run Phillips curve. Okay, so at least in the short run, we'll see this trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Okay, now if we look at those numbers that we had to the right, those bigger numbers, if we were to go through and let's go ahead and add those numbers back up here again. This is looking at slide 12. Well, if we had new data points, well, then what we would do is we would shift our short run Phillips curve out to the right. So we could see, okay, at this point, we've got these higher rates of unemployment and higher inflation. Okay? So let's go ahead and reconcile these 2 points. Let's sort of bring this all back together. So what I want to talk about is, let's assume that either the government or the central bank wants to enact some sort of expansionary policy. Okay? So this could be expansionary fiscal policy, affecting our government spending by raising it or lowering taxes. Or, we might be doing some sort of expansionary monetary policy. And in that case, what we would be doing is, we could be buying bonds. We could be reducing the federal funds rate, the interest rate banks are charging each other. We might be reducing the discount rate, which is what the Fed charges its banks. And we might even be going through and reducing the required reserves. Okay, we're doing some sort of, expansionary policy to reduce unemployment. So if we did that, what we would end up seeing is movement along the curve to the left, up and to the left. And so what we see is that at least in the short run, there's a trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. We went from that original U percent to a new point, right? When we went from point A to point B, and we don't know what these numbers are, but let's say that the natural rate was 4%, we might go down to 3%. And if at 4% the inflation rate was 3%, the inflation rate now might be 4%. So those numbers are going to change. Now, what we also know is that in the long run, the inflation rate at B, which we saw over there as pi 1%, becomes the new expected inflation rate. So let's say that the economy adjusts and those new inflation rates become what we expect to have happen. This is similar to, when we looked at the 2010 FRQ question, 2010 question number 1, and it was talking about when we have an inflationary gap, what's going to happen? Well, we're forced to pay these higher prices. And in return, our short run aggregate supply would decrease. And eventually we went back to the long run aggregate supply. Well, in this case, we're going to go ahead and return back to the long run Phillips curve. And so this SRPC is going to end up shifting to the right. And so what we have is a higher price than what we originally had. Now you might be a little confused at the moment. I promise I'm going to break this down here in the upcoming slides. But what we end up seeing is that if we expect a higher inflation rate later, we're still going to be at this natural rate of unemployment. Okay? Any fluctuations that we have, if we end up going to this point right here, that's only going to be temporary before we ultimately move back to our long run point. We're not going to stay there forever. What we do know is that point A will end up moving up to that point B and then ultimately to that point C right there. Okay, any change will eventually bring us back to our long run amount. So on that next slide, on slide 14, just takes everything I had and sort of helps you out, because I know on the slide it becomes sort of a weird mashup of text. So on slide 15, we're sort of doing the opposite. Here we want to use some sort of contractionary policy. We've got high inflation, so we're going to cut back on government spending or raise taxes via fiscal policy or through monetary policy. Let's go ahead, we're going to sell some bonds, we're going to raise the required reserve ratio, we're going to raise the discount rate, and we're going to raise the federal funds rate. Any of those actions are going to end up resulting in lower inflation. However, because it shrinks the size of the economy, we're going to have a greater unemployment rate. And so if we were at the natural rate of unemployment when we did that, this would shrink us down into a recessionary gap. Okay, the economy would move smaller, and on the Phillips curve, we would see that as movement down into the right. Let's say that in the long run, that new inflation rate becomes the new expected inflation rate. So this is sort of opposite of what we did last time. So instead of, whenever we were fighting inflation, businesses are now forced to pay their workers more money. Whenever we've got high unemployment, now the business gets to choose what they're going to pay. If you lost your job, and let's say your job was paying you $20 an hour, and that job no longer exists, and you go apply and you found a job that pays you $10 an hour. It's not ideal, but $10 is still better than the zero which you were making, so you're going to take that lower paying job. Or if I'm the boss and I've got 2 applicants and everything else is equal and one's willing to work for lower wages than the other and there's no other difference, I'm going to go with whoever's the cheaper labor, because that's less wages I have to pay. Well, if that becomes the new expected inflation rate, well, what we end up seeing is eventually moving back to long run. We're not going to stay in that recession forever, and when we return to our long run equilibrium point, short run aggregate supply would have increased, which means that the short run Phillips curve would decrease. And so kind of what we see right here is this idea of a mirroring effect. Okay, there's a mirroring effect. And I'm going to go ahead and go over that together with y'all. So this mirroring effect is a really cool way that we can see the ADAS model linked to the Phillips curve. And I think that learning this is going to help you if you've been struggling up until this point. I know most of us have the aggregate model down packed, but seeing these two graphs side by side really seems to help students out. Anytime we see a change in the aggregate model, we can reflect that and make a mirror image of it on the Phillips curve. And both graphs are going to give us similar ideas. Okay? We can look at them as mirror images. And I said this before, but I want to, remind this message again. Okay, these two models are not equivalent. It's not saying the exact same thing. All right, the ADAS model is static. Okay, but the Phillips curve is giving us a change over time. When I'm saying static, I mean it's kind of like a camera, just click, takes a photo. We're looking at it in that moment. But the Phillips curve, we saw all those dots, we're looking at all those changes over time. All right, the ADAS model gives us a one-time change in the price level, either giving us inflation or deflation. The Phillips curve is going to give us those continual changes over time. So as long as you keep in mind that it's not the same thing, it's just showing similar concepts, you'll be good to go. Okay, so let's go and take a look at this. And like I said, I think that this is going to help. One last set of tips for you is that the natural rate of unemployment, UN, and full employment output, YF, are always going to be the same number. So bringing that again, the full employment in the U.S. is someplace between 4 to 5%. Currently in the United States, at the time of me recording this video, this is middle of April, we're sitting right now at about 4.5%. I mean, we're smack dab in the middle. So long as there's no cyclical unemployment found. So if there's cyclical unemployment at all, we're not fully employed. We're at full employment even though there's people without jobs. Okay? Because there's always going to be people, again, seasonally, frictionally, or structurally unemployed. So the natural rate of unemployment, which is the amount of unemployment found when there's no cyclical unemployment, is also going to be 4 to 5%. Now, one more thing, okay? I know I keep saying one more thing, but one more thing for this section right here. If we have a shift in AD, if there's a shift in AD, we're going to move along the short-run Phillips curve. If AD changes, so if aggregate demand gets bigger, aggregate demand gets smaller, we're going to move along our short-run Phillips curve. Now, if we shift SRAS, we're actually going to shift the short-run Phillips curve. Okay? Shift in AD means we're going to move along the line. Shift in SRAS means we're going to shift the entire line. Okay? So here's what I mean. So here's actually an example. And, I've got the graphs being set up for y'all right now. And so if you take a look, all right, we're going to go ahead and, in this instance, we're going to increase aggregate demand. Okay, so I've got aggregate demand, and I made it a yellow line so we could see it a little bit better. And I've got yellow dots signifying where we currently are. So in this case, if we look at this aggregate model, what it's telling us is that this country, and let's go ahead and say the United States is currently in a recession. So we want to do some sort of expansionary measure to get the economy back to full employment. So what we want to do is we want to increase AD. All right, and if we increase aggregate demand, we know that we're going to go ahead and shift aggregate demand to the right. Now, because these graphs are going to mirror each other, if I'm shifting my aggregate demand, and it's going to go, let me mark this for y'all real quick. If I'm shifting AD, and AD is going to move for me up into the right, what that means is that I'm going to move on my short-run Phillips curve up and to the left. Okay, so we're going to mirror. So if you were to look at yourself in a mirror, it's going to kind of reflect that image. So if I'm moving up into the right on one graph, the other graph's going to move up into the left. So let's take a look at that. AD is going to increase. We're going to shift aggregate demand to the right. And what we've done is we drew a new line. I've done this one in orange. We're going to put all of our dots, put our labels, put our arrows. Remember, it's really important when we're graphing that we include all those things. So we've got some sort of change. It could have been a change in consumer spending, gross private investment, government spending, and or net exports. Some sort of determinate change. Well, therefore, that would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. And we know that anytime AD increases, therefore real GDP and price level will increase. And anytime GDP goes up, the unemployment rate will go down. Anytime price goes up, the inflation rate would go up. Well, for the Phillips curve, that just means we're going to move up and to the left along the short-run Phillips curve. Okay? So we are going to move. We're not shifting SRPC, we're just going to move. If 80 changes, we're going to have movement along. All right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So in this case, we're going to go and draw another aggregate model on the left-hand side. And this time I'm using the color green to show our starting point. And let's say that we want to decrease aggregate demand. We wanted to get rid of this inflationary gap we have. So let's decrease AD. All right, by decreasing AD, we're going to move aggregate demand down into the left. Okay, and if I move AD if I shift AD down and to the left, if I shift AD down and to the left, that means I'm going to move over here down and to the right. So if we put this right here, if this was a mirror, all right, one side's going down into the left, the other side would go mirror of it down into the right. So one of those factors changes in a decreasing manner, therefore causing the opposite effect. Aggregate demand would get smaller, therefore causing real GDP and price to get smaller, therefore causing the unemployment rate to go up and the inflation rate to go down. All right? Now let's take a look at SRAS, because this is where it gets a little bit different. So if we look at this graph right here, we can see, okay, what I did this time is I set us up with a recessionary gap. Let's say we're in that recession, and we know that during a recession, that businesses don't have to pay their workers as much money, because at this point, hey, I'm a consumer, I'm just happy to have a job. Now, that does not mean that businesses are always going to do that, and in fact, we've got protections in place in our country to prevent businesses from scamming off their employees, one such thing being the minimum wage law. However, during recessions, people are more likely to take that lower paying job because it's money. So let's say we have a increase in SRAS. Now, we said earlier that if we increase SRAS, we are not going to move along the SRPC, but what we are going to do is we are going to actually shift our short-run Phillips curve. So we have to mirror. So if SRAS is going to the right, SRPC should go to the left. So if I was to increase my short-run aggregate supply curve, what we're going to end up seeing is an increase in output causing lower prices and lower unemployment. So if we look at that, okay, if we look at that on our other graph, we should be able to see those things. We should be able to see lower inflation and lower unemployment. And sure enough, when we look over here, we can see that the inflation rate went down, and we can also see that the unemployment rate went down. So anytime the short-run aggregate supply curve increases, inflation and unemployment will go down. This is why a lot of students end up liking the Phillips curve graph, okay? Because with the aggregate model, there's certain things we have to imply. If this happens, then that happens. All we're looking at with the Phillips curve is inflation and unemployment. And so it simplifies things, it breaks it down a little bit more, and so by only focusing on those two factors, it's a little bit of a step back from some of the work we've been doing up until this point. On the other hand, let's say that we have a situation where SRAS is going to decrease. Okay? Let's say hypothetically that we are at long-run equilibrium, we were where we wanted to be, and we had some sort of adverse supply shock. Let's say that there was a supply shock, something affected the fruit and vegetable market, and we ran out of produce. All right, we would end up seeing a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply. Now, if SRAS goes down, if it decreases, meaning it's going to sort of move for us, all right? And based off the way SRAS goes, it's going to look like it's moving, all right? If I was to draw it, it's going to look like it's moving up and to the left. Now, I know decrease, we think decrease down. It moves sort of up and to the left. It's a decrease, which means that my shortened Phillips curve, if I'm mirroring, should look like it's shifting up and to the right. Okay, it should be shifting up and to the right. So let's take a look. Okay, and so what I'm seeing right here, what I'm seeing is that SRAS is decreasing, shifting up and to the left. I'm seeing higher prices, and on top of that, I'm seeing a higher unemployment rate. I went into a recessionary gap. But I didn't go into a recessionary gap with lower prices. I went into a recessionary gap with greater unemployment and a greater inflation rate. We call that simultaneous change stagflation. Okay, we call that change stagflation. Okay, and this is one of the things we want to try to avoid. So, in summary, we know that there's a short-run trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. We call this the short-run Phillips curve. However, we know in the long run that no trade-off exists. This is what we call the long-run Phillips curve. And the long-run Phillips curve exists at the natural rate of unemployment. If that natural rate of unemployment will increase, long-run Phillips curve will shift to the right. If it decreases, long-run Phillips curve shifts to the left. So this is nice. There's only one real determinant. If it gets bigger, right, decrease, smaller, left. Okay, this might look like a lot, but really it's just taking those statements and it's giving us, the different ways it'll look. If we have some sort of change in aggregate demand, we're just going to move along the short-run Phillips curve. If 80 shifts to the right, okay, it's going to look like we're moving up and to the left on the short-run Phillips curve, because 80 going to the right looks like up and to the right on that graph, and since we're mirroring, it'll look up and to the left. 80 decreases, looks down and left, so on the short-run Phillips curve, we're going to move down and to the right. Now, for the aggregate supply graph, okay, for short-run aggregate supply, when SRAS moves to the right, that makes it look like it's shifting the line down and to the right. So the SRPC is going to shift down and to the left. And that's going to create lower unemployment and lower inflation. Anytime SRAS decreases, okay, that line's going to look like it's moving up and to the left, or shifting up and to the left, so the SRPC is going to shift up and to the right. And if that happens, we're going to have a greater unemployment rate and a greater inflation rate than what we previously had. All right, so if you have any questions with this, if there's any parts you're still confused about, please shoot me an email. Go on my website. You can even email me through the website. There's a link on there for contacting me. Check out the free response questions. The good news is that at this point, you've learned almost everything there is to learn from this basic intro course. So you're right there. You're at the home stretch. Let's finish out strong. Let's get some good AP test review. All right. Again, if you have any questions, please send them to me. You guys have a great day. Bye.